Well, John Henry Newman is kind of on a hot streak right now, guys. That might be a weird thing to say about someone who's dead, but hear me out here. It was just 6 years ago, in 2019, that he was canonized as a saint in the Roman Catholic Church, and today, on July 31st, 2025, it was announced that he is going to be named the next Doctor of the Church. That's pretty cool. You might have no idea what any of that means, though, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. But first, Newman. So Newman was born in 1801, died in 1890, and converted to Catholicism from Anglicanism in 1845. He is probably one of the biggest figures of 19th century Catholicism, and his conversion story is one of the most famous, which is outlined in his book Apologia Pro Vita Sua. And he is most well known, though, for a work called An Essay on the Development of Christian Doctrine, which I've made a video on, and I'll link to it up here. And it might be weird to say this. It's one of my favorite videos I've made, though. I think it's pretty good. Reading that book of his was a really formative experience for me, and I'm going to talk more about that and what that means for Catholic theology now that he's going to be declared a doctor of the Church. But if you're not familiar with this title, Doctor of the Catholic Church, well, Newman will be the 38th, which means, over a 2,000-year history, that's not very many, but it's also maybe more than you would have thought. You might have thought, Aquinas, Augustine, those are the two. And while Aquinas certainly has a real privileged place in Catholic theology, all of these doctors of the Church, including, I believe, 4 women on the list, have this elevated place, which isn't to say that their writings are infallible or they have the only perspective on theology in the Catholic Church, but is in a sense they are the measure against which, a theologian can strive to be, right? They are held up as teaching the gospel truly and in a timeless fashion that remains relevant to the life of the Church for ages. And so I think it's really fascinating to see that Newman is now going to be on that list. I personally think that this is really great. My relationship with Newman is interesting. In fact, I was on Facebook today. It's where I found out that Newman was going to be declared a doctor of the Church. And there was a Protestant who responded, and he's like, Newman, great. Like the guy who everyone turns to when you just want to slap some doctrinal development on it to call anything kind of apostolic, even if it's not. And I'll be honest, originally when I heard about Newman and his essay on the development of doctrine, that's kind of what I thought. I thought that development of doctrine was all about saying, hey, we don't have evidence that a given belief goes back to the apostles, but we want to say it does. In fact, we have to, because our conception of dogma forces us to say that it's something taught in the original deposit of faith in the things that Christ taught the apostles. And so we're just going to wave this magical flag of development of doctrine, and magically, poof, out comes a way of saying that things that we have no evidence for are in fact apostolic. But in the course of really engaging with Newman firsthand, I came to really appreciate what he's doing. And I think to appreciate it even more, it helps to look at the context that he was in. 19th century Catholicism was in a really interesting place. In fact, I've got a video coming out on Vatican I very soon, which is going to talk a bit more about this. But there was a rise, especially in the German academies at that point, of this new kind of historical critical method known as Wissenschaft in the German. And it really focused on kind of placing the Bible under historical scrutiny using, at least purportedly, dispassionate analysis to see, can these claims really hold up to history? So if we have that on the skeptical end of things, on the other end, we would have certain approaches to scholastic thought and theology that really thought of truth more in a timeless fashion, often in a more philosophical sense, and relied more on authorities to make their case. So, if so-and-so said it, it must be true, or if it's true kind of in the abstract, then the history is kind of only secondary. History is not a source of truth in that way, whereas for the academics, in Germany especially, the historical critical scholars, history was kind of everything. Newman does something interesting, though. I think it's a misunderstanding of Newman to say that his theory of development is simply a historical claim, a kind of empirical claim. You could read Newman that way, of saying, when he's looking at the fact that it's always been claimed by everyone that ever talks about a certain doctrine that it goes back to the apostles, but we can't actually find the evidence for that. You could say that that's kind of a probabilistic judgment that, well, if people have always been saying it, then we can assume that it was said at some point. We just don't have that documentation or something like that. And you could also even read his more, he gives a lot of different types of development, which is another misconception, again, on that video I made. But you could say that, when he talks about ideas having kind of like an afterlife or having a generativity to them that is going to spur further reflection, then it's like empirically the case that a given idea will develop that way. And we can just kind of predict that in almost like a hypothesis testing way of science. I don't think either of those is quite what Newman's doing. I think he is accepting on faith these dogmas, but then is giving a really kind of intelligent and careful way of saying, but how could we go about believing that still using the fullness of our minds and being thinking people? And so I really see him as kind of inhabiting this interesting place between scholastic thought and kind of a more historical critical school. But that might have all been really boring to you, and you might not care at all about it. But here's why I think this is interesting for Catholic theology, generally speaking. One thing is that as the list of doctors of the church continues to grow, it simply is the case that there's a diversity of viewpoints and thoughts within these doctors. Now, they might all kind of profess together the dogmas of the faith, and I'm not saying that they don't. I think that they do, and that there's a real unity among them. But methodologically and kind of just in terms of how they approach things, they're certainly different. I mean, you've got mystics who are going to have a much more kind of like intimate approach to faith, maybe a more direct relational sense. You're going to have real like scholastic thinkers on here. You're going to have people that I would say like are definitely at least flirting with more Platonic thought, Neoplatonic thought, some more into Aristotle, people influenced by a number of different things, right? And then I think to have Newman added to this list is just giving another way of saying that Catholic theology can also be done in this sense. I've been reading Hans Urs von Balthasar recently, and who I really enjoy, and he really harps on the fact that there's a lot of different doctors of the church, and that's a good thing. As much as, Catholics might love Aquinas, he's not the only one. And so I think that this is actually helpful. Now, people could take this kind of two ways. You could see Newman being not only canonized, but then named a doctor of the church and think, so his development hypothesis has won the day. And I think it certainly means that it's licit, it's promoted, and people like it. But I think to say that it's like the only way of viewing it would miss out on the fact that he doesn't make any of the other doctors of the church less doctors of the church. Nevertheless, I do think it's really important that he's been named a doctor of the church. When Newman kind of propounded his hypothesis, I mean, it wasn't guaranteed acceptance at the beginning. He was certainly a big figure, right? But it could have come or gone. And in fact, in the moment in time in which it was written, the Catholic Church, again, was kind of at that crossroads with more historical critical methods, and it looked like the pendulum was going to swing away from those. I think that's the direction Vatican I took. And then Vatican II kind of swung in the other direction in terms of just methodology and how they're going about theology. Now, a lot of Protestants can be uncomfortable with the theory of development of doctrine along the lines I talked about at the beginning, thinking it's kind of a waving the flag away of the difficulties there. But the more I've gone into it, the more I think it's actually really helpful. I don't think any of us can get around development. And so the question should be, are they good developments or bad, and how we measure developments? I don't think any of us want to reject development outright. And I don't know. I think it's a good thing that development can be used for theology to be creative, to be explorative, to see what avenues are open. I know that can be difficult, and that, we might want to make theology only just like biblical studies. And I think we certainly need to ground our theology in sacred scripture. But there's also questions that are going to arise and implications, and theology is continuing to reflect and try to refine its thinking. And at times we make use of new and different concepts, which changes our formulations of how we talk. And development allows us to have a little bit of breathing room there to not just go off the deep end here, to go off the rails, I guess would be the better thing, but to keep thinking, to keep trying to refine our theology, because ultimately a conviction that I've come to, and something I've been exploring on Substack, is that all of our theology is analogical, that we are never going to exhaust God. And so we can always be going kind of further up, further in. You hear me use that language a lot. It's intentional. that we can always be expressing the mystery better. And that's going to require us to use new language, to explore different concepts, and to keep trying to be faithful in the moment and keep developing on those who have come before us. The tradition isn't stagnant in that way, even if it is grounded. So I'm jazzed. I think it's awesome that Newman's going to be a doctor of the church, to be honest. All of this is coming from a Protestant, right? So what does this mean for us as Protestants? I think, in ecumenical dialogue, it's always really important that we understand our interlocutors, right? We understand where people are coming from. And one of the difficulties in kind of Protestant Catholic dialogue is whether we want to talk about the Catholicism of the 19th century, of the 16th century, of the 8th century. There's a lot of different modes of expressing it. And I think that we have seen change and development there. And now, in canonizing St. John Henry Newman, it does seem that the Catholic Church is at least in some ways recognizing the importance of development. And so as Protestants, I think it would only be fair for us to kind of evaluate Catholic theology on the terms that it's set out. Now, we can continue to ask whether that thesis is kind of in line with other Catholic teachings, and that's a good thing to explore. We can ask whether Newman's theory of development is sound or not. I think it's a really interesting one, but you might not, and that's okay. But at the very least, he's someone that we should be reading. And so if you're serious about Protestant-Catholic relations, I would encourage you to check out Newman, right? He's the newest doctor of the Catholic faith, or he's going to be the newest. And so check him out, read his works. You can start with that video I did on his essay on the development of doctrine. My personal goal now, as of this news, I'm going to commit to reading the Grammar of Assent and hopefully making a video on that for all of you in line with that other one. But anyway, that's the news on Newman. Crazy times. I want to know what you guys think, though, especially if you're Catholic. Does this excite you? Does it worry you? The first thing I did after seeing this was text a buddy of mine whose patron saint is St. John Henry Newman and say, dude, your patron saint's becoming a doctor. How cool is that? Are you jazzed? Are you not jazzed? Are you excited? No? Yes? Tell me. Anyway, peace.